Welcome to Learn to Live Stress-Free. This is Christine Wright with Dr. Robert Wright Jr., your go-to wellness coaches of www.stressfreenow.info. Our guest today is Dora Carpenter. We're very pleased to have Dora on our show. She will be speaking on the topic of grief, something many of us may have experienced in a very close and intimate way. Dora is a certified grief coach, certified life coach, speaker, and author. She is one of 8 trainers personally licensed by Susan Jeffers to teach Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway workshops. Working over 12 years in the death care industry, Dora realized that families needed more support after the funeral services were over and the reality of grief set in, and she began offering free grief support workshops at local libraries in Washington, D.C. Dora is a coach who currently offers individual and group programs, and as a certified consumer's funeral consultant, she provides funeral and memorial service planning information. Also, Dora has experienced losses in her own life. She brings this experience to bear when taking care of her clients. Dora is a vivacious, vibrant, sensitive, intelligent, caring, experienced woman who Bob and I are just very pleased to know. Welcome, Dora.
Well, thank you, Christine, and thank you so much for the introduction. It is indeed my pleasure to be here with you and with your audience today.
Yes, thank you, Dora. So good that you could join us today. Dora, what led you to do the work that you are currently doing?
Well, Bob, as Christine said, I worked in the death care industry for many years, assisting families with making their final arrangements for their loved ones. And a part of the services that we provided was to visit the families in their homes. We would either visit a few days after the service or sometimes a few weeks after. And what I found during that time was that the families needed more help then than they needed when they were in what we call task mode or sitting with me making the final arrangements. I realized that they needed more support after the phone had stopped ringing, after the doorbell rings had ceased, after the family and the friends had returned to their daily lives, the house was quiet, and the reality of the death set in. So what I did was I approached my employer, but at that time they weren't really amenable to offering grief support services. So I took their no, made it my yes, got training, and then I just began offering free grief support workshops at local libraries in the area.
That's wonderful that you were so fluid in that process and transition. And I find it interesting, Dora, I love the way you put your words and your phrases together to develop your signature program From Grief to Gratitude. Could you tell us a little bit more about that program and those workshops? What is the process of that?
Sure, Christine. Well, I compare the grief journey actually to navigating the wilderness, or it's like a maze. So people will experience some dead ends, some wrong turns, some crooked paths, and there's really no right way or wrong way to grieve because as we're unique individuals, that grief journey is going to be unique to each one of us. And so for my From Grief to Gratitude coaching program, I don't only address those emotions of grief, but take it a step further so that I can encourage and support those clients in finding gratitude in their new life going forward. So the group program is actually a 6-month program, and what I cover is the reality of death and the reality of grief. Then we go into navigating the wilderness of grief. That's where we address all of those emotions that come with the grief process. We cover those 3 F's, which is fear, forgiveness, and faith. And then we transition to saying yes to your new life and going from grief to gratitude. Then we ended with me helping them define their new life purpose going forward. That's the group program. And then I also do individual one-on-one grief coaching for those who choose to not participate in the group program.
Is there a right time for doing a program like yours, Dora? I know myself when I've seen some people and they've experienced a loss, initially they may be very raw, or they may not realize that their, emotions or feelings are stunted in some way. Do you have a guideline for, if there's such a thing as the ideal time to start coaching? Do you have a recommendation for our listeners?
Time-wise, no, I do not. It's when the individual feels that they're ready. What I do recommend, though, is that you don't use the myth that it just takes time to heal. Because time without action, you'll just wait for time, and then time, and then time. But it usually will depend on the individual, just as long as they know that with help, it does speed the process of going from grief to gratitude.
Dora, can you tell our audience whether or not there are common ways that people experience grief? Also, I was hoping that you could explain how grieving is uniquely personal and how that experience often varies from person to person.
Well, sure, Bob. There's some common emotions of grief, such as your anger, denial, shock, loneliness, guilt, and regret, which, by the way, they're all normal and natural responses to grief. However, each of us is a unique individual with our own unique DNA makeup, so our grief experience or the journey itself is going to be unique to each one of us. There's no common ground in how any individual is going to process the emotions of grief. For example, I've sat with a family of 8 siblings making burial arrangements for their mother, and each reacted differently during that interment conference. One was strictly business and showed no outward emotion of grief. One was angry and upset with me for asking the necessary questions. One was too upset to even participate in the conference. And one seemingly was at peace and at ease with providing the information and going through the process. One was even angry with the physicians who treated her mother. She was angry with the hospital, and of course that anger was directed to everyone else in the room. So when you think about it, all of those siblings were making arrangements for the same mother, but each was expressing their individual emotions or reactions to the loss. So there's no common way that we grieve. There's no right way or wrong way to grieve.
Dora, do you think that in the moment, as you describe the different responses of those siblings, in the moment, have you found over time that the grievers, those who are bereaved, have an awareness of how they're responding, or are they in a numb state? What do you find is their thinking state?
During that period, during that first few 24 to 48 hours, there is that one common emotion, which is shock. So not necessarily are they aware. And to give you another example of an interment conference that I experienced of a mother who was making arrangements for her son, who was a victim of violence, was very, very angry, and it was a terrible experience for her. It was a terrible experience for me. However, after the aftercare appointment and after she came back to the cemetery, I was able to go with her to the site, and maybe it was, I would say, probably a month or so later, she actually came in and apologized. She couldn't really remember how she responded during the time, but she was very, very apologetic for being a person that she said she normally was, and we became true friends after that. So, no, and personally, we can't take those emotions that are directed to us as grief coaches. We can't take them personally because, again, everyone reacts and responds to the emotions of grief differently.
Yes, that's absolutely true. I remember I've had death through the years of people that I know, friends, and relatives, but certainly the most devastating loss was the death of my own mother. And I remember that the minister had said to me, he said, thankfully you'll be so busy in the first initial days making arrangements, taking calls, that you really won't have time to think, which that was the case. And he said a few things to me that was helpful in terms of making arrangements, but certainly I think shock would have been the best description because I wasn't totally aware in the usual way of myself or of people that I was interacting with. So making the arrangements, fortunately, I had a wonderful funeral home that they were very fair and nurturing, because in terms of even making arrangements or planning, I would have said, here's an open checkbook, write whatever amount you want. So I really, in terms of service arrangements, everyone was very helpful because I was not thinking clearly or as efficiently as I would have if I was not in a state of shock and grieving.
Absolutely, Christine. And that's why we say the first 24 to 48 hours, we consider it task mode. And what we mean by that is there are actually over 100 decisions that have to be made during that time. So normally, because you are checking the list, did I do that, did I do that, we encourage you to have a great support group. Someone that either has been through it before or someone that is strong emotionally to go with you to help you make those decisions, because you're not thinking clearly. And then it's usually, as I said before, after that's all over and you're no longer in task mode, that's when the real grief process begins.
Yes, and that does get to be very, for lack of a better word, tricky in terms of how you're feeling and how other people deal with you.
Dora, as you know, communication and miscommunication looms large when a person is grieving, since the pain, the emotional pain from the loss and is so great, and often people are numb, literally. So can you tell our audience, based on your experience, what would be a good way to communicate with someone who is recently bereaved? Often people don't know what to say or how to express their condolences or support. How do you suggest other people support a person who is grieving, whether they are a family member or friends? And can you give, based on your experience, an example of what might be a good thing to say to a person who is grieving and what's not so helpful to say?
Bob, that's a great point to discuss. And it's not our fault that we don't know what to say, because when you think about it, we're taught first aid, we're taught the 911 system, we're taught fire evacuation routes, CPR, and more, and that's great because we need all of those things. And these are situations, though, that may or they may not happen, but we're not taught how to deal with the inevitable, which is death. So in that first 24 hours of a death, one may hear so many myths coming from family, friends, and although they mean well, they're usually not helpful. For example, one thing we should not say, and this is very, very common because we all say it, but what we should not say is, I understand how you feel. Because no, you don't. No one really understands how you feel. Even if a person lost their mother, and you've also lost your mother in the past, you do not know the relationship that that person had with their mother. It's just like when I said earlier about the 8 siblings. They all reacted differently, but one doesn't know the intimate relationship that the other had with their mother. So I caution you to try not to say, I understand how you feel. A few others that are not helpful is, it just takes time. Well, yes, it takes time, but we can wait for time to pass and time to pass and time to pass. We need action in addition to it. Another one is, it was God's will. Well, that may make the person feel, well, what did I do to make God so angry with me? Another one that's used commonly, again, meaning well, people will say, you're young, you can marry again. Or, you're young, you can have another child. Another one, he was ill. You should have seen it coming. And one that I always recommend you not to say to a child, but it comes naturally because that's the only thing that we can think of saying at the time, is to say to a child, take care of your mother now. Or either to say to a young boy, you're the man of the house now. That puts too much pressure on a child. And so then you may be saying, okay, so Dora, what is the proper thing to say? And to answer that, I get that question all the time after I say what not to say. But sometimes silence can just be of the greatest comfort to someone who's grieving. Let them know that you're available for whatever they need. And if you know that person's routines, if you know what they do normally on a day-to-day basis, just offer to do them. So in other words, you may say, I'll pick up the children from school today. Or I will go and do the grocery shopping. I'll drive your mother to dialysis on Thursday, or I'll babysit the children on the day of the memorial service. Another thing is just to embrace the person. Well, I'm a hugger, so embracing is easy for me. And then I can just say, I'm here for you. That works for me. But you might also say, and this is a very powerful thing to say, I can't imagine how you feel. Because when you say you can't imagine how one feels, it allows them to open up and talk about the death or their feelings if they choose to do so. And I like to illustrate that by saying, comparing the two. Let's say I'm saying to you, Bob or Christine, Bob, I understand how you feel because you lost your mother. When I lost my mother, blah, 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 blah. Well, Bob doesn't really want to hear that because, no, I don't understand how he feels. But if I say to Bob, Bob, I can't imagine how you feel.
I think those suggestions are pure genius, Dora, and listening to you enumerate them sounds so simple and so easy and so elegant, but I think what's happened is many times the thought never occurs to us, and many of the things that you're saying, I think most people don't experience. There may be a few people who naturally know this and naturally do this, but I think what happens is people err on the other side. They think the person is grieving, so they avoid them rather than offer to pick up the children or take mom to dialysis, that they say, oh, let's not bother them. Or they may call and ask them, how are you feeling? Which, well, I'm not feeling so good. And that sort of puts the person grieving in a predicament. These are really wonderful and I think very simple to do supportive behaviors and statements that, as you said before, most of us are not educated in how to deal with this inevitable experience in all of our lives.
That is correct. That is correct, Christine. And that's why grief support is not just for those who are grieving. It's also for those who want to help others who are grieving. And it's a topic that no one wants to talk about. No one wants to talk about it, but we all need to hear it. So we hope to do more in getting out into the community and allowing people to come in and talk about the inevitable and how to handle it and how to help others go through it.
Well, Dora, I'd just like to segue from what you have just mentioned, because in my research on grief, there's an existential component where this taboo of silence, where a person dies and then no one in a family context or a friendship context will mention their name, and it is almost as if that person had never lived. I experienced that in my own life, and I've seen that with other people. So my question to you is, could you give our audience any tips for ways of thinking about how we as individuals and and in the family setting can break through this taboo of silence. And I'll just use this personal example. When I was in my 20s, I had a first cousin who passed away unexpectedly. And after there was a lot of confusion about, how could someone so young die, and she had a small child, etc. In any event, once she died, no one ever in the extended family context ever brought up her name. And the reason I mention this is because I was startled. It was about 25 years later. I was in a backyard barbecue, and I went up to her parents and I said, I used to see your daughter when I used to walk to high school. I used to run into her on the subway, but I don't know her birthday. When was her birthday? Well, even though this was 25 years later, the tears welled up in their eyes, the look of horror and shock. And at that moment, I felt it was almost what I call a Fred Flintstone moment, me and my big mouth. And so, of course, I excused myself and later apologized. But that experience for me brought out this thing of it creates a hole in the fabric. So, and I've talked to so many people where, oh, well, yeah, somebody close to me died, but we never talk about it, especially men. So do you have any suggestions in terms of, because this is a very large thing societal-wise. So I know this is a large question, but you have such a good handle on grief recovery and healing. I was wondering if you can offer something here in that respect.
Bob, yeah, that's something that as a community as a whole that we have to address. And we're getting a little more creative in getting people to talk about it. No one wants to mention the elephant in the room. And it's, as you said, there's certain reasons. One is the person who wants to mention it is afraid of the negative effect it will have on the person who's lost someone. So, again, it encompasses that whole negative connotation of the word death. My process to help us move beyond that is to start to talk more about life. And my belief is that if we talk more about today, the now, life, then long-term it will be easier, or it doesn't necessarily have to be long-term. It will be easier for us to accept death and to not see it as such a negative connotation. For example, we all get up in the morning and we leave our loved ones and we just assume they're going to come back that evening. So in whatever position we're in as they leave, whether it's not saying goodbye, not saying I love you, not giving a hug, not saying I forgive you for not taking out the trash, not doing any of those things, it's because we know or assume that they're going to come back. Well, what if we knew that there was no guarantee that they would come back? Anytime our loved ones left, wouldn't we live our lives in the now? Because death is inevitable. And we look at it as something that's going to happen to someone else, or we don't accept or recognize the fragility of life until a death hits us and we have to go to a service or we have to go to a funeral home. But death is inevitable. Yes, it will visit every household. So let's start living in the now, and then my belief is that if we do so, it will eliminate at least two of the major emotions of grief, which are guilt and regret. But I can go on and on and on about that. So
we love you going on and on about that. That's very wise. Dora, there's something that you said that I just want to highlight, not in response to this question, which what you said is very wise and very beautiful. You said something earlier, which I have noticed, that when someone expresses or asks the person to open up and they start to tell their story, the person doesn't let them tell their story. They tell their own. And, well, when this happened to me and when that seems to be some sort of human quirk of one-upmanship, that really we need to be in listening mode at a certain point, and certainly in those early times, and let the bereaved do what they need to do rather than telling them story after story of what happened in my life.
And that's true, Christine, but and that's innocent from the person's perspective because they think that's helping. Because, again, it goes back to education on the subject and how to help others. Because if you're saying, if I see you and you're grieving and it's because you've lost your child, if I've lost my child, the only way that I know to help you is to tell you my experience. Not understanding that, no, it's more helpful for me to listen to her story, but we aren't taught that. So it's from an innocent perspective.
I do believe that it is because it's about sharing, but this is such a delicate time that the normal ways of sharing may not be helpful. So certainly going through the process with guidance the way you offer in your workshop would be of benefit to many of us because we're not taught this in school or in our day-to-day. Dora, I want to ask you another question because Bob and I have wondered about this ourselves, and in our own reading we've seen titles on the gift of grief or of loss. But this is such a painful experience and sometimes debilitating, but at the end of it there can be a transformation. How does grief change people? What does it do in terms of they're looking at their own life and their search for meaning in the world?
Christine, that's a great question because I'll give you a little fact that's a little startling. But as little as 2% of unresolved grief can affect every area of a person's life. And that's why, as grief coaches, we say it's so important for people to work through the grief and not just go through the grief. Again, it ties into that myth that it just takes time. Because when a person's hopes, dreams, and expectations have been shattered, they search for meaning. They search for reflection. They search for what's in the future for them. They fear as a result of what has happened. There's an emptiness. There's a hole in that heart. And that's why, even though most of us think that we'll be okay and that we don't need assistance and support and encouragement in going through, we do. That's why the coaching program doesn't stop with just addressing those emotions of grief. But what I do is go further and encourage clients to find meaning and purpose in their new life going forward. No, life will never be the same again after loss, but it can be meaningful. So if that grief is not addressed, it's possible that one can stay stuck, and they don't even realize why it's difficult to move forward in other areas of their life, such as their career, or such as their relationships, or such as making friends, because there may be a lack of motivation to do so. And it could just result from unresolved grief. That's why one of the things we address, I don't do a lot of it, is children's grief, because children grieve also. But as adults, we tend to say, oh, they're okay, they're fine, they're doing better than we're doing. Well, that may be what you think, but children are very sensitive, and if they see you as parents upset, they won't get upset because they don't want to hurt you. They already see you as upset. What happens is it doesn't manifest until they're teenagers, and then they start what we would say call acting out. And sometimes if we trace that during our grief groups that we do with children or teenagers, is they never really address. They remember grandmother dying, and they remember all the family coming in, and they remember everyone being sad, but they were either sent to the room or they were never able to go to a child support group. So it may even manifest later on in adulthood if it's unresolved. So I say, if there's anyone who's currently dealing with a loss, I just always like for them to ponder this question. If you're going through a loss right now, and if you're experiencing those emotions of grief, a question to you would be, would you trade some of the happiest days and the fondest memories of your loved one for the pain of loss that you're experiencing now? Usually the answer to that, Christine and Bob, is no. And it usually will begin the shift that's necessary for you to move forward.
That's very profound, Dora. What you have said, everything that you have said, is really so beautiful, and it's obvious that your caring and your knowledge of this topic is a true gift. And I want to thank you so much for being with us today. Now, Dora, on your website, you do mention your coaching programs, and you have told me you also do some in-person events. Could you tell us a little more about what it is that you offer online, on the phone, in person?
Sure. We do several things, and the website is updated regularly. For anyone that may be listening that's in the Washington, D.C. area, I do at least once a quarter free grief support for the community. And again, these are free. It's a free grief support workshop. It's open to anyone who is in the process of grieving, who knows someone that's in the process of grieving, or someone who wants to help someone who's in the process of grieving. And then coming up in December, that I will do the 21-day Holiday Grief to Gratitude program. That's a virtual group coaching program to help individuals through this. The holidays are one of the most challenging periods of grief because you cannot avoid those sights, the sounds, the smells of the holiday season. And it's difficult when you can't avoid the holidays and you're feeling the emptiness of loss. So we'll be doing that again this year. And then there'll be other programs that are coming soon, but all will be on the website at DoraCarpenter.com.
Wonderful. Excellent. So we will certainly let people know about it other than those listening. Again, you can find out information about all the programs that Dora offers on her website, which is www.doracarpenter.com, and that's DoraCarpenter, DoraCarpenter.com. Dora, thank you so much.
Dora, I'd just like to wrap this podcast up with this question. If you had to identify one key point or some understanding that for our audience that they could take away today, what might that be?
Wow, Bob, it would simply be my mantra, and it's this. Everything in life is temporary, including life itself. So decide to say yes to the gift of now, because you have a responsibility and obligation to live your life for the rest of your life.
Well, thank you, Dora. That is so beautiful, and I'm sure our audience will get that clearly. I want to thank you for being our featured podcast guest today, and I want to thank our audience for listening. Today, our featured podcast guest has been Dora Carpenter. I want to thank you for listening, wherever you are, in whatever time zone you are in. We welcome and look forward to your comments about our show. Please contact us through our website with your feedback and suggestions. Remember, listeners, if you'd like to experience the same benefits our coaching clients get with us and learn how to get control of your schedule or easy ways to dissolve your chronic pain, stress, or anxiety, feel free to call us at 954-900-2787. 2179. Mention that you heard our Stress Free Now podcast show, and your first session is absolutely free. Call today to schedule your appointment. For Christine Wright, this is Dr. Robert Wright Jr. of www.stressfreenow.info. Until next time, be safe and be well.